Anthropic, Google, and OpenAI have all responded to a call from the White House to share their suggestions for what the US AI action plan should be. Welcome back to the AI Daily Brief. Today, we are talking AI policy. And this has actually been sort of an underexplored area over the last year or so. I think the US election cycle last year crowded out a lot of space for this discussion. But as AI heats up, obviously there's geopolitical dimensions, but there's also just the fundamental underlying how policy and regulations are going to interact with industry and shape the set of options that we have when it comes to these tools and how we approach them. Now, specifically, one of the first acts of this new Trump administration was unwinding the Biden AI policy. A few days after inauguration, President Trump signed his own AI executive order, repealing the one that had been signed by President Biden. It was, as so many EOs are, filled with rhetoric but devoid of policy, leaving a vacuum in its wake. Then in late February, the administration opened a 2-week comment period for input into what they're calling the AI Action Plan. And throughout this week, big US-based labs have been weighing in on the policies about what should come next. So today we're going to go over the responses from OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic and see how they are alike, how they differ, and what it says about what US AI policy should be. On Thursday, OpenAI published their proposal. Setting the tone, they borrowed from Sam Altman's prior writing to state, "We are at the doorstep of the next leap in prosperity, the intelligence age, but we must ensure that people have freedom of intelligence, by which we mean the freedom to access and benefit from AI as it advances, protected from both autocratic powers that would take people's freedoms away and layers of laws and bureaucracy that would prevent our realizing them." Now, throughout the document, OpenAI's policy prescriptions hit on 5 major topics. They requested a, quote, regulatory strategy that ensures the freedom to innovate. This is largely about ensuring that partnership with the federal government was voluntary, and it repeated OpenAI's oft-made point that US AI labs should be unshackled from, quote, overly burdensome state laws. Basically, OpenAI is saying that we need federal legislation that overrides state laws because companies are going to be significantly slowed down if they have to deal with 50 different regulatory jurisdictions. When it comes to export controls, OpenAI wants a focus on ensuring that American AI is widely available. They suggested a, quote, strategy that would apply a commercial growth lens, both total and serviceable addressable markets, to proactively promote the global adoption of American AI systems and with them the freedoms they create. In a larger letter that they published simultaneously, the company also requested changes to the Biden diffusion rule that divided countries into 3 tiers and placed limits on middle-tier countries including India and Israel. They want these limits rolled back to only cover countries with a history of failing to prevent controlled chips from entering China. And China is indeed a big area of focus for OpenAI. They in fact include a proposal to ban Chinese AI and force close allies to follow suit. Using DeepSeek as the prime example, they wrote, "As with Huawei, there is significant risk in building on top of DeepSeek models in critical infrastructure and other high-risk use cases, given the potential that DeepSeek can be compelled by the CCP to manipulate its models to cause harm. And because DeepSeek is simultaneously state-subsidized, state-controlled, and freely available, the cost to its users is their privacy and security." One of the juicier lines in their report, "The CCP views violations of American IP rights as a feature, not a flaw." There is, on the one hand, the appearance of a noteworthy tension here. OpenAI wanting a ramping down of export controls to allow American AI to be deployed globally, but at the same time proposing to force a ban on Chinese AI if countries want to maintain Tier 1 status. I actually think it's less incoherent than it seems. It basically all amounts to a much more strict focus on China as the problematic country in the equation, and a stronger emphasis on American competitiveness and giving people access to non-Chinese models as a competitive force. One of the more controversial suggestions from OpenAI was a carve-out from copyright laws to allow AI training. OpenAI tried to frame this as a balanced approach that still protects content creators, but asserted, "The federal government can both secure America's freedom and learn from AI and avoid forfeiting our AI lead to the People's Republic of China by preserving American AI models' ability to learn from copyrighted material." They commented that if Chinese developers have unfettered access to data and American companies are left without fair use access, the race for AI is effectively over. OpenAI gave the example of the EU model where data mining is allowed, but there are broad opt-outs for rights holders. They noted that the UK is also leaning in this direction with revisions to their copyright law currently being debated. One of the big points of discussion on Twitter following this was people pointing out that OpenAI had invoked national security concerns to justify a copyright exception. But whether you think that justifies a copyright exception or not, which reasonable people can disagree on, I do think that we have to assume that China will 100% not care about copyright when it comes to enabling its companies to train models on copyrighted materials. And so if we decide to care about that, if we decide that the rights of copyright holders are important enough to stop training on their materials, that is effectively accepting that's an advantage that the US is going to let China have. Again, I'm not drawing judgment one way or another. I'm just saying that is implicitly a part of this conversation. On infrastructure, OpenAI proposed a wide range of government investment, including open sourcing government datasets and a range of other measures, large and small. Their biggest ask was a massive build-out of power transmission infrastructure that equals the national highway build-out of the 1950s in scope. Finally, OpenAI suggested a big push to drive AI adoption within government departments. They included a range of policy changes that would make the process easier, but the bottom line was encouraging public-private partnerships to update the government's tech stack. Their overarching view on strategy was that, quote, the US needs to pursue an active international economic policy to advocate for American values and support AI innovation internationally. For too long, they said, AI policymaking has paid disproportionate attention to the risks, often ignoring the costs that misguided regulation can have on innovation, national competitiveness, and scientific leadership, a dynamic that is beginning to shift under the new administration. Google asked for a similar fair use exemption from copyright infringement in training data. They didn't go so far as to label copyright enforcement a national security risk, but did claim that fair use could be allowed, quote, without significantly impacting rights holders. Their argument was largely commercial. The point that negotiation with data rights holders are lengthy and highly unpredictable. The company also called for a winding back of the Biden-era export controls, calling for the replacement to be, quote, carefully crafted to support legitimate market access for U.S. businesses while targeting the most pertinent risks. Again, they pointed out that placing additional burdens on companies is likely to put them at a disadvantage in the global market. Also present was encouragement for AI adoption in government agencies, along with uniform federal laws and government spending on infrastructure. Interestingly, Google seemed to take issue with the Trump administration's push to cut the budget for foundational R&D. They claimed that, quote, long-term sustained investment in AI research had given the US a, quote, crucial advantage in the race for global AI leadership. Google instead called for the government to significantly bolster these efforts. On safety, Google seemed to be calling for a similar liability shield that was handed to internet companies in the 90s. They called for a clear delineation between the responsibilities of model providers and users, noting, the actor with the most control over a specific step in the AI lifecycle should bear responsibility and any associated liability for that step. In many instances, the original developer of an AI model has little to no visibility or control over how it's being used by a deployer and may not interact with end users. Google also criticized safety disclosure requirements in the EU as overly broad. They opposed any transparency rules that would require, quote, divulging trade secrets, allowing competitors to duplicate products, or compromising national security by providing a roadmap to adversaries on how to circumvent protections or jailbreak models. Moving on to Anthropic, their proposal had a very different set of priorities, as seemingly befits the safety-focused company. Their central premise, one that CEO Dario Amodei has been making in interviews recently, is that AGI is coming, and the government only has a couple of years to prepare. Their number one recommendation was establishing national security testing for model capabilities. Anthropic proposed tests of both domestic and foreign models for national security implications. Their proposal on export controls was to ramp them up significantly. In addition to chip controls, they called for requiring government-to-government agreements for countries hosting large chip deployments and reducing no license required thresholds. Anthropic also suggested bringing AI labs into the intelligence structure. They called for classified communication channels with intelligence agencies, expedited security clearance for AI professionals, and, quote, the development of next-generation security standards for AI infrastructure. Joining the other labs, Anthropic called for scaling energy infrastructure and accelerating government AI adoption. Their final recommendation leaned on recent discussions by Amodei, suggesting that the government needs to start preparing for the economic impact of AI. They write, to ensure AI benefits are broadly shared throughout society, we recommend modernizing mechanisms for economic data collection, like the Census Bureau's surveys, and preparing for potential large-scale changes to the economy. Now, if you've been paying any attention at all to what Amodei has been saying lately, you'll understand exactly where this set of priorities is coming from. Dario noted that China is known for, quote, large-scale industrial espionage. He commented that Anthropic and all AI companies are almost certainly being targeted, adding, many of these algorithmic secrets, and there are $100 million worth of secrets that are a few lines of code, and I'm sure there are folks trying to steal them and they may be succeeding. This is not unfounded paranoia, as numerous government officials have warned of a sharp uptick on foreign spies trying to infiltrate tech companies over the past year. Some have even made the point that during the era of nuclear science, the entire field was classified information. But in the AI era, methods of building advanced technology are openly discussed at Silicon Valley house parties. So what is the sum total of all of this? A couple things that stood out to me. The general tenor of the submissions is very accelerationist. Even Anthropic's more alarmist proposal is not asking for AI progress to be slowed down. Instead, it's basically asking for an equal commitment to accelerate certain safety aspects at the same time. And it's very clear that the entire US industry wants to move faster to beat China to develop powerful AI. In terms of the approaches, there's a mix of deregulation, pro-business, and government subsidy being proposed. But the biggest point of consensus is that everyone wants restrictions to be lifted and a well-defined policy structure that allows the labs to accelerate. If you've been tracking the changes in attitude, none of this is particularly surprising. It's just very notable how much the tone has shifted from a year, or especially 2 years ago. There were basically zero concessions here to generalized safety concerns, and to the extent that there were safety proposals, they were clearly defined and came with specific recommendations to mitigate. TLDR, if you think things are moving fast now, you ain't seen nothing yet. Now, of course, what the Trump administration does with all of this remains to be seen, but we will, of course, cover that as it comes out. For now, that is going to do it for today's AI Daily Brief. Appreciate you listening, as always, and until next time, peace